She's a senior content designer at HubSpot, who is obsessed with making information clear, useful, and enjoyable. Officially started her UX career in 2007. Since then, she's been helping companies like Expedia Group, Nike, and Motorola craft better content experiences. Ariel's local here in Seattle, and she lives with her three-footed tabby, whose name is Chloe, I believe, right?
Cora.
Sorry, I got it wrong.
It's okay.
And we're happy to have her here tonight to talk about how to gain influence and build collaboration in your team. So I will let Ariel take it away.
Thanks, Paula. I'm happy to be here talking about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I have been on a number of different kinds of teams, both in-house and agency, and content design sometimes gets a little bit of side saddle. And I wanted to share some of my experience becoming a little bit more of a leadership voice on my teams and making sure that I've got, kind of a strong say in the strategic part of things and influence on my teams. And a big part of that, though, is about building collaboration. So I'll be talking a little bit about building collaboration as well. And as we go along, love to hear your questions. Well, you can put them in the chat, or you can come off of mute and interrupt me. I am happy to go either way. So without further ado, I will go ahead and show kind of what we're going to talk about today. I'll go in a brief introduction. The first kind of area that I want to cover is about integrating in your teams and gaining your voice. And then the second piece that I'll go into is how do we actually build that collaboration piece, that collaboration muscle? And then there comes the hard part, right? Raising red flags and making decisions, which can often be a little bit of a challenge and cause some anxiety for folks. So I wanted to share some tips around that. And then finally, becoming a leader. And then I'll wrap up with some takeaways from the rest of the presentation. So by way of introduction, I think as content designers, we're really in a unique position where our discipline is not new, but relatively speaking, it's new. And I think there's often a situation where teams can be unclear about how and when to involve us. And unfortunately, what that ends up meaning is that we can get left out of really crucial strategic conversations, which I mean is kind of a bummer because we have so much to offer in that realm, right? We think in terms of the conversation that the user and the product need to have with one another. And I think personally that conversation sets the foundation for the entire product design process. So it is, to me, a very crucial piece. I think it's also important for us to be part of the conversation because we think in systems. So that kind of plays into user experience cohesiveness and scalability. And then next up, I think we're really skilled at distilling goals, strategies, and tactics. And if you've ever worked on projects of any kind, you know that it's kind of easy to start getting down in the weeds and be starting to have folks really pressing on pet projects. And when you are able to come up for air and say, no, let's look specifically at our goals, strategies, and tactics and what we've agreed upon and where we're going with this project, that can be really helpful. And I think we're particularly skilled at that. And then finally, we're just darn articulate and we're practiced at documenting our thinking. We can write, we can talk. And those are really important skills to have on a team. So to remedy that fact of not necessarily being asked into strategic conversations, most of us have been in a position where we've given the sort of why content design is so great pitch. I know that I personally have spent time to develop how to work with me presentations and given those presentations on various teams. But those things in and of themselves don't always net us a seat at the proverbial table. So how can we really gain influence and move into strategic leadership on our teams? I think a large part of this really depends on your personality and your work style. But I wanted to share one way to get there. And this is, I'm going to be talking about this through the lens of my experience joining a team that was working on an editor platform for the CMS product at HubSpot. So I was really brought into that project after the designs were already drafted and the product was halfway built, which was kind of an interesting place to come in on. So that's an important piece of the story because it had some ramifications for how I integrated and how I gained a voice and some of the nuance around how I did that. What it meant is that the team's likely expectation was that my role would be basically to review the existing navigation labels and the UX copy and the mocks, maybe make some suggestions about how to improve them, and then maybe pick up some additional writing tasks that arose as the project progressed. It also meant that I came into the project at a time when many of these strategic decisions had already been made. And I needed to somehow figure out how to do my work within those strategies. But the first order of business really, in order to get my work placed within those strategies, is to really understand them. So I started asking questions. I wanted to make these informed decisions. And the questions I asked were things along the lines of like, well, what did we know about our users' context to inform that strategy? What IA logic have we thought about? How should I be following that IA logic as I label things? And what I found is that not all of these questions had been answered. Another piece about this is that asking all of these questions that late in the game really could have been seen as a challenge to the team. But by following a few of these guidelines, I actually was able to establish myself as a thoughtful participant in the design work. The team really understood why I was asking the questions I was, and they became really willing to backtrack a bit to get me the information that I needed. So some of these guidelines really have to do with, I made sure to acknowledge previous work. I made sure that I was aware of what folks had already done, and I made sure to acknowledge it in my own thinking. I also came from the stance of being a learner, so putting myself in the shoes of somebody who was coming to this project and needed to learn from those folks who had already been invested in it and involved in it, and being genuinely curious to receive their knowledge and receive their answers to my questions. I took a lot of that information and synthesized it. And so one of the ways that I became a little bit more of an integrated voice on the team is by taking the role of creating connections among all the pieces of information and ideas, summarizing them, and then repeating back them to the team. And that really showed that I understood. And it also gave the team this idea that, hey, here's this person who's actually going to be able to put these pieces together for us and tell a more cohesive story about the product. And then finally, another piece about it was really starting to just build these connections, connecting my expertise with the expertise of others, and quite frankly, just being a friendly voice is another big piece of it. So part of being a thoughtful member of the team actually means that sometimes you're going to raise issues and make hard decisions. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how I approach those moments with this team. What I learned during my integration phase with that team is that there had been some strong interaction thinking, a lot of excellent discussions about technical constraints, but very little foundational discovery work. So as you'll remember in the slide where I talked about asking a lot of questions, some of the things that I uncovered were that the team as it stood had not done some basic things like card sorts to discover the IA. And I knew that as a pretty user-centered designer myself, that I wasn't going to be able to make good design decisions without that background. And from my standpoint, I really want the foundations of the design to really be grounded in user needs. So I decided to go ahead and raise a red flag with the folks who were leading up the team, which was a team that kind of included myself as well. Raising a red flag is hard. In doing this, I really could have been seen as a blocker. But instead, what happened is the team rallied behind me. And here are a couple of tips on how I made that happen. The first thing I think is important here is that you want to start with the good. I think it's important to express and compliment where you see strong thinking and process, and make sure you highlight that. The second piece is compassion. And I think expressing your concerns in a way that acknowledges that there may be some pain involved in pivoting is important. And then also to show that you're willing to take some of that pain as well. Like, and from my perspective, I came at it and I said, hey, I know that backtracking a little bit like this is going to cause us to step back in time a little bit. And I'm willing to take on some of the onus of that, meaning that later on down the project line, I am going to have to be really, quick and focused about my work in order to make sure that we're meeting timelines. So I think kind of being willing to take some of that is a big piece of the team accepting me. I think it's also important to explain your rationale. So instead of just saying, here's what I think we should do, be clear about what success looks like from your perspective and why the issues you're flagging detract from that, and why your thinking is what you're thinking that supports those statements that you're making. Fourth thing is to really be inclusive. As I've mentioned before, I think it's really important to refer to things you've learned from other team members and questions they've brought to the table. That piece where you acknowledge other people's work comes up again and again for me as I think through how to make sure you're an effective voice on a team. And then finally, I think it's really important to bring solutions to the table, not just problems. So if you can have a plan for how to remedy the situation and bring that to the table, that's a really important factor. Along with that, I think the need to be willing to flex is important. Be able to hear feedback on your ideas and be willing to find ways to make those ideas come together. All of the guidelines I've offered so far had the result, at least for me, that I actually grew to be seen as a leader on the team. So now, finally, I was actually being invited to all the crucial conversations. And I found my calendar full of meetings, which can be its own problem and its own challenge. But I was really glad that I was being invited to these crucial conversations. It made things a lot more streamlined, and it meant that I could be a lot more proactive in communicating my work with the team leads. In addition, I think because the questions and solutions I proposed were fundamental to a strong design process, and also promised to answer some of the questions everybody was having, like everyone was having these questions, not just me. The team really began to see me as a key design partner and a member of the leadership team on this project. And I think that's important because I think a lot of times there's a view that content people aren't necessarily aware of or involved in the design process. And so for me, being able to speak that vocabulary, the example I've shown here is a classic double diamond design process, which is a language that a lot of designers really understand. Being able to kind of talk about my solutions and my ideas along the lines of that design process really gained me a little bit of authority. So I highly recommend couching your statements, your ideas in some design thinking and design process models. So once you're in this seat, though, I think it's important to keep a couple of things in mind. So when you're in a leadership role, I think it's important to lead with humility and not hubris. Asking your teammates about historical knowledge about the project and showing that you're considering that as you make new design decisions is a great way of making them feel included and not like you're coming in and kind of a Napoleon kind of a way and just tromping all over everything that they've done. That said, I do believe it's important to be strong in your opinions, but just be soft in their delivery. I think it's important to offer recommendations with conviction, but also with warmth and a smile. There's nothing wrong with coming into the conversation and having a little bit of friendliness around it. Another thing that's important is asking the people on the ground. So not just the team leads, but the folks who are down in the pixels or in the code working on the project to find out what their needs are, and then to be their advocate, to come up to the leadership, the folks who are leading the project, and to advocate for their needs and to advocate for how we integrate those into the way that we're thinking about moving things forward. And the fourth piece is document your decisions and rationale. It's really important to document stuff because that way you can refer back to things. And when conversations do tend to take that spidery, we're going off in a lot of different directions, it's really great to have those documents to come back to and point to them and say, this is what we decided, this is the goal we're working toward, and how can we roll up our actions toward those goals. So this brings me to collaborating. And I think there's a skill set or maybe a practice or a knowledge area, I guess, whatever you want to call it, that kind of underpins everything I've said so far. And that is, of course, this idea of collaboration. There's been a lot of thinking done on the subject, and there's a lot of great reading out there giving some general guidelines. So I'll go over a couple of those, and then what I'll do from there is walk through another case study with a different product design team where the idea of the collaboration clearly drove measurable success. So you can see a situation where collaboration was a key part of actually moving the product in a successful direction with respect to our customer satisfaction scores. All right, the 6 C's of collaboration. This is a common framework in literature about working styles or teamwork. These vary and shift a little bit depending on the focus of the author or whoever is writing them down. But a common set often includes these ones: context, clarity, communication, critique, cooperation, and compassion, or also sometimes termed as collegiality. Of these, I think the most important may be communication. Communication skills are something that most of us work on throughout our professional and personal lives. And there's like a whole industry out there developing or offering communication skills education. It's really that important. One of my favorite frameworks is NVC, or nonviolent communication. If you haven't heard of NVC, it's definitely worth a Google. I've learned a lot from just looking at high-level readings about NVC, and I bring those to my conversations every day, and I think they really support collaboration. All right, let's go a little bit deeper into a case study example of collaboration in action. So this particular project that I'll be talking about was the domain setup flow for the CMS free tier. And the kind of backstory behind that is that when HubSpot decided to add a free tier to the CMS plans, we realized that what we were doing was introducing it to a much wider range of users than our other offerings. Our other offerings were more along the lines of professional and enterprise folks. So bringing it to a free tier meant that our users that didn't necessarily have existing knowledge about domain connection flows. The way that we had expressed domain connection flows in the interface was simple enough for people who have those basic understandings of things like domain name system, secure sockets layer, and other technical aspects of working with domains. But when we brought that down to free, our CSAT analysis showed that we couldn't assume that knowledge when catering to DIY content creators who are coming into this product without that kind of knowledge. And just to back up, CSAT, for anybody who doesn't know the acronym, means customer satisfaction scores. Based on those CSAT findings, we identified 3 primary goals for the work. We wanted to ensure that users were getting accurate error information by improving the DNS validation system. So that's kind of an interface thing. We also wanted to reduce confusion around the steps in the connection process. And we also wanted to contextualize what was happening as users went through the process. And you'll probably look at those and think, well, those last 2 are really big content things. So it was important that I was a part of this project. And a really good part of this project is that I was brought in at the very beginning. So I was able to have some influence. Now, backing up a little bit, HubSpot has had a content design practice for a long time. And as a company, it's really championed that content design process or practice. We have a lot of content designers working across a lot of initiatives, but even so, for some of the teams, the practice is still new. So in the case of this particular project, the product designer I was working with had never worked directly with a content designer. And I was actually totally new to HubSpot. So there was no established process for the way we would work together. We really had to work to get our collaboration figured out. To do this, we took a couple of steps. One was to discuss the problem space together and make sure that we both were on the same page as to how our understanding of the problem itself. The other piece that I did was I looked at the product design timeline and I made sure to negotiate room to do content design activities. A lot of times, if a product designer is not used to working with a content designer, they've scoped something out that doesn't necessarily have room for the kinds of activities that content designers need to do in order to do their job. And so that was a negotiation piece that I worked on with the product designer. We also made a commitment to looping each other in on our thinking prior to making decisions. And we decided to make decisions together as a team. I think one of the best things that we did was that we were really explicit about working phases, responsibilities, and priorities. So we actually wrote those down and iterated on that document as we worked together. And then when it came to actually doing the design work, we worked together in the same Figma document. We agreed on a certain page structure and certain areas where I would work versus where the product designer would work. And then pages where we were going to be working on them together in a synchronous manner. The process didn't always go exactly as planned. I came upon some hairy questions and areas that needed further research during my content audit phase. And what this screen here shows is an example of an annotated visual content audit that I did that basically outlines where some of the issues are with the content and where I wanted to do some additional digging. If you kind of look at some of the things that I came up with, there were some places where I didn't actually know how to answer these questions. I didn't have the domain knowledge to be able to write them in a way that made sense. So there are these areas that needed additional research, and other areas that really needed some untangling. So why do we express the subdomain and have a pre-fill, whereas the brand domain doesn't necessarily have a pre-fill? These were questions that I needed to have answered. Addressing these problems could sometimes feel a little bit like it added time to the process. And again, it's one of those things where you have to be willing to say, I understand that this is going to add time to the process, and I'm willing to untangle what that means for our timeline. I'm willing to take on some of the work that means. And in retrospect, I would say that team would say that this process of uncovering problems and requesting to have deeper discussions was actually really crucial to the success of our designs. I think one of the biggest benefits of having content designers on a team is that we have this ability to see and call out these information issues. But of course, it does need to be done with consideration for the work your teammates are doing. So a lot of the guidelines that I mentioned previously come into play in how you negotiate this. I think another couple of things about this particular interaction is that some users reported that they didn't know that they were getting into an hour-long process here. So one of the things that I did in order to address this was to add some messaging about how much time it would take before the user dives into the flow. So I set some expectations, and you can kind of see that on the right. We estimate that hosting setup will take a total of 15 to 80 minutes, and that's the real. Now people understand that they're not necessarily going to get this done real quick before they get their next cup of coffee, right? This is a little bit more of an involved process. Another thing that we did in order to solve some of these information issues is that the existing messaging about pre-provisioning didn't really give any indication to the user about the order of operations they needed to take when taking that option. And that caused issues down the line. So I added some explanation language that said that it needed to be done in this particular manner, before DNS settings are changed in this case. And then another piece that we did was, together, the product designer and I reworked the steps in the flow so that they each encompassed one task and flowed into one another in a way that made sense. So in doing this, I also kind of advocated for including content that included some of that expected time information for various steps down the line. So all of this collaboration had an effect, and we were really pleased that it had a really positive effect. 1 month after launching the new content and design changes, our CSAT scores had increased by 21 points, which is a pretty significant jump. We had 81% of our respondents say that they were happy with the experience, whereas previously that figure was in the low 40s. But what really let us know that we had achieved our goal were some of the comments that came in. For me, words like simple, easy, and user-friendly that peppered the feedback were the most rewarding. You can see a couple of the comments that we got from customers here. They were able to follow the whole process smoothly and feel assured that they did it correctly. Just hearing the word "thanks, guys" is also really rewarding when you've worked on something and you've tried to make the process a little bit better. My personal favorite comment, though, that we got back from customers expresses one of the usability maxims I come back to often, which is they said they didn't have to think. And this is just my little shout out to Steve Krug and his little booklet called "Don't Make Me Think," which, if you haven't seen it, it's a really good it'll make you feel really good about the work that you do, and about why you do the work that you do. So ultimately, I kind of wanted to wrap up what this success came down to. And in this case, I really think the improved messaging that contextualized the process and gave assurances and clarified complex actions was a huge part of the success. Obviously, simplifying the interaction was another big part of the success, so that users can clearly see the steps. But probably most of all, aside from those real specific things, I think we were successful because we had this tight collaboration and communication between the product designer, the content designer, myself, and the engineering team. And that made us able to really reduce churn and foster solutions. So all in all, I think collaboration was the key piece to why we had this success. So kind of going through all of what I've said so far, I kind of wanted to highlight that I didn't necessarily have an easy task ahead of me when I jumped into these teams. I think how I handled myself in bringing gaps to light and requesting time for content activities could have honestly been disastrous. But instead, I was able to be accepted as an important voice on the teams. And I'm not saying that to say, hey, I'm awesome or toot my own horn. But I think when something works, it's worth sharing. And I hope that maybe this has inspired you to share some of your own successes as well. We'd love to hear about them. I think what I learned through this process is that there are just some fundamental things that I can embody that make me a useful team member and not a drag, such as being brave and believing in myself, but also doing so with compassion. And that is it. I would love to hear what has worked for you guys for your collaboration. And of course, any questions that you might have.
That's great. Thanks, Ariel. I'm going to kind of jump back up. We've got a few questions, and then I'm guessing we'll get a few more as kind of you start to talk here. But Tess and then Lorene kind of chimed in on this too, asked, can you teach how to be a more patient person?
Yes, actually, I'm a certified yoga teacher, and I have to say that my yoga practice and my meditation practice is a huge piece of my ability to be more patient with folks. So yeah, hire me.
Lorene also asked, did you have, I think you kind of spoke to this, but did you or do you have formal power and authority, or are you an informal leader wielding influence without formal power? So I've heard this kind of called, leading from the side, or democratic, small d, democratic leadership.
Yep.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yes, in my case, it is totally informal. I am not in a leadership role. I'm an individual contributor. There are some high expectations, I think, at HubSpot of senior practitioners for sure, but there is no, my stepping into leadership is something that I have done, like Paula said, in this small d democratic way. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this presentation, is that you as an individual contributor, if that's what you are, can still take leadership and can still have a strong voice. That's kind of my rallying cry.
That's great. Tess also asked, would you be comfortable sharing any failures or things that you've tried that didn't work? Sometimes as you know, sometimes we learn as much from what didn't as what did.
Absolutely. Yes. It is a little bit in my nature to not necessarily be patient. And so I have to do that practice of being understanding that there are so many different ways of learning out there, and there are so many different knowledge gaining capabilities among people that it is on me to make room for those. I think one of my biggest failures in the past has been that I have literally interrupted people and stepped on their comments in a way that it would be considered steamrolling. And I have had to be called out on that. and it doesn't feel great. But I'm really grateful to my colleagues who have been able to compassionately call me on these things and say, hey, this wasn't necessarily, I didn't feel like I had a voice because your voice was louder in the room. And that has been a pretty strong failure that I've made in the past. It doesn't make people feel comfortable to collaborate. And I would definitely recommend, if you have those tendencies, work with yourself, get your Zen on. Something I've had to do in my own practice.
Yeah. Well, that's tough. And that is sort of, you're talking about having a seat at the table. Sometimes, it can be hard to get your voice heard, right? And so that tendency, to just say, but I know the answer to this, or I have, I can fix this. It is hard not to jump in. And I say that as someone who's kind of had the same feedback now and then too, which is like,
Yep.
I just want to say something here.
I know, and do it from a place of wanting to be helpful, not wanting to like squash anybody. But I think it's important to say, let me hear your thoughts, and then I'll tell you mine.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's a really good response to that. Tess is saying I've also been called a steamroller, so I feel you. Shannon asks, when you were making the case to take on the content activities, were there any books or research that you turned to as ways to communicate the value of that?
In these particular experiences, no, but in my practice in general, one book that I have referred to pretty consistently is the content. It's Megan Casey's book. It has a lot of tips, tools, and techniques in it. Hang on just a second. I have the title right here. It is the Content Strategy Toolkit. I've used that as a reference to point to say, here's an activity, here's why I want to do it, and here's what the benefit is. And that's been really helpful. As far as research goes, I don't have any specifics that I can offer, but I know that in just the way that I've read and educated myself, I know that the research is out there. But yeah, I would love to see resources that other folks have that show the ROI basically of doing content design activities.
Great. Okay, Jesse, I don't want to take us too deep into the weeds, but I'm curious about the way you work in Figma files with your design partners. Oh, this is, I'm sorry, having had some experience myself of trying to work with people in Figma. I'm feeling this one. I'm still hashing that out in my newish role. Hard not to think of it as the product designer's file and feel like an intruder.
Yes, that's a really good point. One of the things that I do in our Figma files is I create what I call a content design playground. And I will go ahead and copy over mocks that the product designers have worked on and futz with them in the content design playground. In that way, I'm not touching their hard work. I'm not messing with their pixels. I'm not messing with their dimensions. I'm not ruining their componentry. But I'm still giving visual examples of the way that I'm thinking through things. I have gotten to the point where I am able to use Figma in a way that utilizes components. And because of that, because I do create componentry, product designers are often able to take my work and literally copy paste it into their work. So I do recommend getting familiar with how to use components in Figma, so that when you do your work and you express your thinking in that visual format, you're not creating more work for them, right? You're giving them something that they can easily just move into their work without messing up what they've done. So that's my big recommendation there with Figma.
Sorry, I was I was muted. Okay, so Shannon has a response there, found that it really depends on the personality of the designers when working within Figma. She mentioned she's had good luck creating separate pages. With some designers, they're comfortable with her editing directly in the file. So
yeah, I think that's a good point.
kind of a comment there. Yeah.
I think it really is personality driven. I've worked with designers who are open to me literally editing on the file itself. Because I've shown that I'm competent in Figma. But I also am right now working with a product designer who is just very, very protective of their Figma files. And so I just choose to work in a different page.
Yeah. So Lorraine kind of chimed in to say it seems like this kind of thing would lend itself to a conversation about how two people would want to work together, which kind of calls back to you talking about kind of having that sort of upfront, in the case study that you shared, that you had those meetings up front and you were able to kind of say, how are we going to collaborate here, and maybe setting some of those ground rules.
Definitely.
I'm curious, I mean, to kind of flip that on its head, I mean, so we're talking about how you can kind of work with or sort of accommodate the working styles of the owners of those Figma files. Do you see a sort of reciprocal effort there for them to kind of accommodate your style and bring you in as a real partner there?
Yep, I've started actually working with this designer who is a little bit more precious about her files. I've started developing my own types of files, and instead of working in mocks, I work in frameworks. And those frameworks are boxes and arrows. And they essentially lay out the conversation that the user and the product are having with one another. And I establish that as the basis for her work. So she kind of has to take my work into consideration in order to make her work happen. And that changing that dynamic is happening slowly, but it is happening.
So I'm just curious, kind of which comes first there, because it seems that, there's sort of chicken and egg there, right? So are you able to kind of, get content requirements and, sort of your strategy around that communicated sort of before people begin kind of creating those designs and kind of get into the weeds of Figma?
I'm starting to, yeah. It's taken some doing. But I am.
Because I'm guessing, yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Speaking of interrupting.
No, go for it.
No, I was going to say, I'm guessing a lot of us have had this experience of, having to sort of retrofit content to a design that someone has very much committed to, or, if you're a consultant, if a design has been sort of sold in to a client and you have to come in and sort of be the one to say, well, that doesn't actually, it doesn't support the content, or, how are we going to actually kind of shoehorn in what we need to get into this? And that can be a really awkward position to be in. So.
Yeah. And those situations, there's not a ton you can do. I think one of the nice things for me about working more in an in-house situation is that I've been able to establish, there's like, the rumors have gotten out that you include Ariel early and often. So, I've been able to really establish that with my teams. And in the case that I'm kind of describing here, where I'm putting my work first, I basically came to the team leads and I said, hey, this is a really content heavy piece of work. Why don't you let me establish the content and establish the content framework and the content strategy before the designer starts working on the mocks? And I framed it as, then the product designer doesn't have to write copy. they don't like to write copy. They don't want to write content. They don't want to have to make that stuff up. It's not fun for them. So when I frame it like that, they're like, oh, yeah. Please bring on the content. Let's make some space for you to do that.
So just for my own curiosity, and hopefully this is interesting, a good question for other people as well, but can you kind of just walk through sort of the workflow of, where do you get your sort of direction from? And then kind of what is that sort of whole process kind of from the sort of the inception to the delivery?
I wish that there was one that I could cite. I'm in the process of kind of creating that as we speak. I think that what I'm trying to move toward is a situation where the initial conversations about goals, strategies, and tactics are a collaborative space that I have with the PM, with the product designer, with the engineering team. And then from there, I strongly advocate for doing a content strategy first and to actually do that as the foundational piece of the rest of the work, because to me it's a skeletal frame on which the rest of the design can then emerge. And so from there, I'll create something a little bit more concrete, something more along the lines of a messaging framework that will even start to even develop content, right? And develop what the conversation is between the content or the user and the product. And then the product designer can come in and say, from there, let me go ahead and make a journey or a flow. And then from that flow, let me go ahead and start to put some pixels to paper. And that's another place where we can also collaborate, is as they're starting to put pixels on paper, I'm saying that's going to be 500 words, or that's going to be a page, or that's going to be one line of text. So how can I can help guide you in how your interface actually needs to be designed. So that's what
I love how you phrase that as the conversation between the product and the user. That's just a great way to talk about how people interact.
Yeah.
So I wanted a couple more questions here. Actually, Lorraine talks about, and it isn't really a question, but this is a great idea. So she mentions they have a working styles questionnaire that they use to help people collaborate better. Lorraine, I can unmute you if you want to say a little more about that.
Well, the website I help manage is actually about frontline healthcare teams working together. So it's actually a tool we created for them, but it can really be used by anyone to kind of surface what your own work style is. And if 4 or 5 people do that together, can help you realize things about how other people like to work, so that you don't press their sore buttons or either intentionally or unintentionally. And people seem to like it. So why not use it? And I just realized it's a fillable PDF. Yay for us.
I love that. I went ahead and opened that link, and that looks really awesome. I also want to call out the link that Kat posted about intent text, placing or creating more effective placeholder copy. I'm just kind of skimming that article that she wrote, and it's yes, so much yes.
So Shannon asks, how many teams are you supporting? And especially with being early and often, how do you balance supporting multiple projects at the same time?
I ostensibly support 7 teams, which is kind of crazy. The way that we have managed that is to focus my work on 1 or 2 top priority areas. So we look at we call them OGPs. They're also known as, KPIs or what have you. There's all sorts of acronyms for what are our top goals as a company or as a product area. And my managers are very much on board with me spending a good chunk of my time, 80 to 90% of my time on those 1 or 2 top priority areas. And then what that means for the other teams is that they have to self-serve. And so another big piece of my work is creating the ways in which they can self-serve. So we're working on a strong content design system and content patterns and guidelines system that folks can use in order to self-serve some of their content development without having to bug me.
Well, what's interesting, so the next question that I see here, and this is really interesting. So this is Cora, I hope I'm saying that correctly, talking about working on a remote team where the designers and she are on different sides of the world. So talked about asynchronous communication. Love to know if you have any advice on how to compassionately leave clear and concise questions or rationale. I worry that I'm an async steamroller. Ooh. So that is a challenge, right? When you are, it's one thing to be able to, communicate face to face, but if you are interacting with your team over Slack or whatever whatever technology you're using, how do you adapt your style to asynchronous versus synchronous communication?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a tough one because they're almost like, I almost want to say there's not really any way around it. But the one thing that I found that's been really helpful is to spend a little time on creating rationale documentation. And so I like to do a little TLDR. Here's my thinking and here's why I think this. And append that to whatever asynchronous feedback I'm giving and say, here, refer to this Google Doc that has sort of my rationale in it. And that seems to be really helpful for bringing people on board a little bit with, just showing that I am being thoughtful about this and that I'm not just saying, do it my way.
Well, and I think, obviously written communication has, just by its nature tends to be more, or come off potentially anyway, as more formal. Mm-hmm. And so kind of expressing, I think what this question is kind of getting to too, is how do you kind of convey that, you talked about compassion and communication and, kind of delivering messages, delivering those hard messages with a smile and with a warmth, Yeah. How do you do that when someone isn't, in the room with you or at least in real time with you?
Yeah. One real simple way you can do that is honestly just to repeat back what people have told you. Takes up space, but it's often really, it's a good tactic saying, I hear you. I hear that you said X, Y, or Z. And here's my thought on that.
All right. Tess has got a couple of things here talking about documenting rationale and strategy. Why don't is Tess still on? Maybe I'll just unmute you and let you kind of talk about the strategies you're talking about here.
Yeah.
You're talking about documenting rationale and strategy and then content acceptance criteria, which is another.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm like bombing the comments. Yeah, I was just responding to Koresha. And it was what you were talking about, Ariel. One thing I started doing was just documenting in little notes in Figma if I know there's going to be an async review. I try to start by documenting what is it that we know about the user and what the user really wants and needs in this situation, and making sure kind of we're grounded on the same page there. And then I'll leave little notes about my rationale regarding this is why I put this here. This is why I wrote this way. Just making sure something has everything so it's there. And then there's this other idea that I've heard, and I haven't tried it yet, but I would like to. Not my idea. I'm not claiming it, but I think Ben Romano came up with this idea, but it's the idea of creating acceptance criteria for content. So just like you would for a user story for an engineer, you do it for the UX content, and you work with the stakeholders beforehand to determine what that acceptance criteria is going to be. Basically, what the user needs to be able to do and what the user should be able to do. And then you review the content that you write against that criteria only. So it helps avoid this situation that we often find ourselves in of content by committee and a lot of cooks in the kitchen. So yeah, I'll stop there.
That's great. I have much reading to do tonight. Oh, I love this comment from Jesse too, that Loom is a great tool for async. I've been using that as well. It took me a while to want to use it because I don't like hearing my voice. And when you do a recording, you can hear your voice. And you're like, shit, everybody else is going to hear that too. But it really is so good for collaboration because people respond to people and people respond to faces and voices. So I think that there's something to be said about just the psychological environment that you create by delivering something in person. I think that's really a great tool.
I hear you on not liking to hear the sound of your own voice. Yes. That's a problem for me too. Okay. Anything else? I think we've gotten through the questions that are in the chat, but if anybody has anything else they'd like to share or ask, someone is asking what's Loom. I actually have not heard of Loom either. So although I'm guessing from context, it's a way to sort of do voice messages.
It's a way to record little videos. You can basically do a Zoom, but it's static. It's a Loom, and then you send a link to the Loom to everybody that you'd like to get that information, and they watch it. Yeah, it's a good tool.
Yeah, that's great. Good to know. Jesse, yes, let's allow you to unmute. There you go.
Thank you. I just wanted to add in a note that Loom has one of the best onboarding flows from a content design standpoint I have ever seen. I stopped in the middle of setting it up so that I could start from the beginning and take screenshots of every single screen.
Wow.
It was that good. Yeah.
That's amazing. That's interesting. Just so you know, you're a content designer when
Yes.
take screenshots. Go through a process more than once to make sure you see how it all works. That's cool. I think it says mentioning acceptance criteria used a lot on the Gov UK sites. You can see them on their info pages. The link there in the chat. Gov UK obviously comes up a lot as in these examples of how to do this kind of thing well.
Awesome. Great questions, everybody. Thank you. It's been super fun answering them.
Yeah.
It's been helpful.
Anything else, or shall we wrap? I think we're starting to lose people to dinner or meetings, depending on what their time zone is. So again, we thank everybody for joining us. Thanks, Ariel. Wonderful to have you present and not just be another smiling organizer face in our events.
Thanks for the opportunity. It was great to chat about the topic.
All right. Good night, everybody, and hope we will see you at our event in June with Michael.
Good night. Good night.
Buy my book.